This is Dr. Brian Armstrong, and this is the first of our pre-recorded lectures for Humanities 2001. Our first lecture will focus on Hinduism, and we are going to begin with a line of text and an image. The line of text is on your left, and it is one that presumably you read last week while doing your reading questions. However, there's a good chance that you did not understand this line of text. We'll read it, and I'll mention two ways it might fail to make sense, and then we'll set it aside. The line of text is this: when he sees identity in everything, whether joy or suffering, through analogy with the self, he is deemed a man of pure discipline. This is something Krishna says to Arjuna in the course of their conversation. It might make no sense to you because it is so abstract. It might make no sense to you because those words in English already mean something to you, and what they mean to you is not the same as what they mean within the context of Hinduism. In either case, we can overcome the obstacle of lack of comprehension by trying to understand the cultural concepts with which we describe Hinduism more fully. On your right is Ganesh. Ganesh is an avatar or manifestation of the divine. He functions as a god who can be worshipped within Hinduism. He is the god who helps one overcome obstacles. Ganesh overcame a major obstacle himself. He was beheaded, but did not let that stop him. He obtained the head of an elephant and continues to live and function with the head of an elephant. If you were a traditional Hindu and you were taking Hinduism and saw Hinduism as took humanities and saw humanities as an obstacle you had to overcome, you might pray to Ganesh to help you overcome this obstacle. We'll see if we can't overcome some of the obstacles before us in the course of this lecture. There are three key outcomes I want you to get out of this brief lecture. First, I want to introduce you to the distinction between a simple and a deeper grasp of a cultural concept. You should already have a simple grasp from last week, but there is a deeper grasp that is available to you, and you'll typically need the deeper grasp if you're to do well in the course. I also want to introduce you to the connectedness of the various concepts. Each of these concepts is part of a larger whole. And the larger whole is that culture's perspective on what it is to be human. A failure to grasp one concept can affect your grasp of the perspective as a whole, and thereby affect your grasp of other concepts. So, if you want to understand any one concept well, you need to understand the other concepts also, and the connections between the concepts. And understanding the connections between the concepts is what will enable you to step into and understand these different cultural perspectives on what it is to be human. Finally, I want to introduce you to some basic factual knowledge regarding the traditional Hindu perspective on the nature of the human and the divine. We'll start with a reminder of the concepts with which we're working. We defined these briefly last week. We defined them simply. There is moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth; samsara, the cycle of rebirth; dharma, one's sacred duty; karma, the consequences of one's actions; kama and artha, pleasure and power or profit; atman brahman, the true nature of each individual self; and jiva, the individual soul. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, three avatars, are manifestations of the divine; and yoga, discipline; guru, master; and shishya, disciple. We'll start with the divine. The name or the word for the divine is Brahman, with an N. Brahman is defined within Hinduism as utter reality, utter consciousness, utter blissfulness. Utter means complete and total. Brahman is pure being. Brahman is the only being. There is only one reality, one nature, one being in existence, and that is Brahman. If you think otherwise, you are, from a traditional Hindu perspective, deluded, ignorant, and overcoming that ignorance will be crucial to achieving moksha, reunion with Brahman, with God. There are two main symbolic versions of God within Hinduism. One is the transpersonal notion I just gave you. Here we symbolize or conceive of God as a total abstraction, without attributes, aloof, apart from us, apart from finitude, apart from reality as we experience it. This is a very abstract notion of God, and it's one with which it's hard to have a personal relationship. Therefore, there are personal or more personalized symbolic versions of God. This is God as we perhaps commonly think of God. God as having attributes. God as doing things, such as creating, preserving, destroying. These personal notions of God, these symbolic versions of God with which we can have a personal relationship, are called avatars. They are manifestations of Brahman in some capacity. The three key avatars of Brahman are Brahma, God in God's capacity to create, Vishnu, God in God's capacity to preserve, and Shiva, God in God's capacity to destroy. These three avatars help us to mitigate the terror of rebirth. In other words, as we face death, we are afraid that we will be reborn and will have to suffer again in yet another body and yet another physical existence. We turn to these avatars and develop a personal relationship with them, one of piety, one of worship, in an attempt to escape rebirth and achieve moksha, liberation from rebirth, reunion with the divine. These avatars, then, are, as it were, paths back to Brahman, ways that people can turn away from a false view of reality and towards a true one. Most Hindus worship Shiva or Vishnu as God, in the hopes that the grace of Vishnu or Shiva will help them to escape karmic rebirth. Vishnu is the avatar or manifestation of Brahman insofar as Brahman preserves the order of what is. Because of his role as preserver god, Vishnu has a special love for humans and takes on human form more than any other avatar of the divine. Vishnu's avatar, the human incarnation or manifestation of Vishnu, is Krishna. Vishnu takes on the form of Krishna so that he can more easily communicate with humans and help them to play a role in the preservation of the order of things. So then, Hinduism is monotheistic. The traditional Hindu believes that there is a single God or divine essence, Brahman. However, it appears polytheistic, insofar as Hindus actively worship avatars, manifestations of this one divine essence. So Hinduism may appear polytheistic due to its many idols and images of gods, but at its core, Hinduism treats these gods as merely concrete representations of a single divine essence. Therefore, Hinduism is essentially monotheistic. We can think of each avatar as a path back to union with the divine, a way of turning ourselves towards the divine. There are other ways of thinking of these paths. We might think of our path towards God in terms of the goal we set for our life. The goal we set for our life will determine the sort of life we lead, and it will provide a path to or away from reunion with God. In other words, from moksha, from liberation from the cycle of samsara and reunion with Brahman. The goals will vary from person to person. Just as one person, based upon who she or he is, might feel more inclined to worship Shiva as opposed to Vishnu, so various individuals will set different kinds of goals for themselves in this existence. The four traditional goals within Hinduism are kama, the pursuit of pleasure and love; artha, the pursuit of worldly profit, wealth, power; dharma, the pursuit of the performance of one's duty, in other words, the attempt to live righteously, morally; and moksha. And here the goal is liberation from the constraint of worldly existence. We can divide these goals into two kinds of path. There is the path of desire. So if my goal is pleasure or power, then I am pursuing something that will satisfy me as an individual. And in these paths, the meaning of existence centers upon me, the individual. The other two paths are paths of renunciation, in which the meaning of life is located beyond my individual soul. If I focus on dharma, I'm focusing on what I must do for my society, my community, my social group. If I'm focusing on moksha, I'm focusing on beings, on realities that exist not just outside of me, it might seem, but outside of this world. As you might be able to infer at this point, the paths of desire, focusing on kama and artha, are far more likely to keep one locked in the cycle of samsara. The paths of renunciation, focusing on dharma and moksha, are what are far more likely to lead to reunion with the divine. These four goals commonly coincide with the traditional Hindu life stages. The first stage is the student stage. One is young, one is unmarried, one is focused in large part on the pursuit of pleasure and love, perhaps that person whom one will marry and with whom one will seek to build a life. One is also focused on one's studies so that one has a means of earning a living upon marriage. The second stage is the married stage, in which one moves away from a focus on kama and comes to focus more on artha, on developing the power, the influence, the wealth that will enable one to secure a good life for one's family. The third stage is retirement. Retirement age in traditional Hinduism is 57. And as one retires, one withdraws from social obligations and begins to think more about the meaning of things. In particular, about what one ought to do and why one ought to do it in this life. As one nears death, one finally turns, perhaps finally, to moksha. One begins to worry about what is going to happen to one's soul after death. And it is then that one might begin to truly focus on what is needed to achieve liberation from the cycle of rebirth. In the Gita, we encounter Arjuna at his peak. He is a warrior, but he is an unusual warrior for reasons that we will soon see. The first concept at which we'll take a closer look is dharma. The Sanskrit word dharma means, quite simply, that which supports. It is the underlying principle of the moral order within the individual soul, of the social order within a group, and of the cosmic order, the order of the cosmos as a whole. In a larger sense, it is the law that expresses and maintains the unity of all creation. It is the essential order of things. In a narrow sense, it refers to an individual's sacred duty. It can also refer to an individual's essence. One's essence is one's dharma. One's duty is one's dharma. In other words, one is called to be what one is, and what one is supports what one does. And ultimately, what one does ought to support the larger order of things in which one lives. Closely connected to dharma is the idea of karma. A karma is a deed, that which is done. But in a larger sense, it is the web of cause and effect. It is not simply the act, it is what follows from the act, and it is my relationship to what follows from the act. We can understand this more fully if we think of the paths of desire, actions focused on kama, pleasure, and artha, power and wealth. If I perform an act solely out of pursuit of pleasure, I am far more likely to perform an action that will hurt someone else and that will generate what we might call bad karma. In other words, there might be something that would satisfy me, that would give me pleasure, power, profit. However, that same action, which would give me satisfaction, might hurt the other person if I use that person as a means to the end of satisfying myself. Such a deed would have negative consequences, and I would have an improper relationship to those consequences, insofar as I might perhaps not be concerned with the negative consequences for the other person. If I live my life that way, I am going to be reborn. However, simply doing one's dharma is not enough to escape samsara. We can see this if we think of the opening book of the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna looks out at the battlefield, and he sees two armies gathered. Each of the warriors has a dharma, a duty, to fight and defend his or her group. However, Arjuna realizes that what is motivating these men is not so much their sense of duty. Rather, they are motivated by kama and artha. They are motivated by the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of profit. So, they might be performing the right action, but they have the wrong relationship to that deed, to that action. They are focused not on the rightness of the action, but on the fruits of the action, on what they will get as a result of what they do. And they are not concerned with the harm that they will cause to others. Others will be a means to the end in their pursuit of pleasure and power. Arjuna is different. He stands back and looks at everything from a dharmic perspective, wondering not just what he should do, but why he ought to do it. And he becomes concerned by a paradox, a dilemma. He is worried that performing his dharma will lead to samsara. He is worried that if he fights his evil cousins and kills them, he will be creating negative effects, suffering for them, and so will have to be reborn. It is Krishna's job to explain to Arjuna his misunderstanding. What he needs to realize is that simply if he performs his dharma, intent on the fruits of action, intent on the fruits that he will get for himself, then yes, he will be reborn. But there is a different way to perform one's dharma. One can perform one's dharma without being focused on the fruits of the action for oneself. It is that way of performing one's dharma that will help one to escape the cycle of rebirth. Because when one performs one's dharma in that way, one is acting in accord with a fundamental truth about the connectedness of all beings. This leads us to the second bullet point on this slide, which is a rather heavy and abstract one, but if we walk through it somewhat slowly, we can perhaps make sense of it. The idea behind karma is that all creatures are ultimately responsible for their own existential conditions. In other words, when you are born into a body, into a physical existence, your body is healthy or not healthy, has defects or does not have defects. You live in an environment that enables you to flourish, or you live in one that leads to great suffering. Ultimately, all existence is suffering. There is no escaping pain. For the Hindu, though, existence is suffering because it is bound up with action, and all action has consequences. And the performer of an action must always experience those consequences in an existential state. Now what happens is that we all too often perform deeds that create suffering, but it creates suffering for others. And we remain ignorant of the suffering that we cause others. We think of other people as different from, as separate from, as distinct from us. It is thinking of the other as separate from me that makes it far more likely that I will hurt that person in the pursuit of my own satisfaction. However, as we know, the reality, the truth, is that there is just Brahman. There was only one reality. And from that perspective, from the perspective of that truth, we are all connected. So if I perform an act that has negative consequences for you, I am actually performing an act that has negative consequences for me. To be aware of the truth is to be aware of the suffering of the other. If I remain ignorant of that in this life, then I must be reborn into a life where I experience directly the suffering I caused for the other. And in that next life, the proper response to my suffering should be a recognition of the unity of all things, of all beings. It is only that awareness, the awareness and the grasp of that truth, of the connectedness of all things, that would lead me to act only in a way that brought into consideration the suffering, the worth, the needs of all beings. That will lead to moksha. Moksha is liberation from samsara, or the cycle of karmic rebirth. It is achieved by identifying oneself with the pure self, Atman. In other words, when I act, I should think not just about what I want, but I should think about what each self wants. Doing one's dharma in this fashion leads to moksha, but karma will always be an important educative force in the process of achieving moksha. The purpose of karma is to teach, the purpose, according to a prominent Hindu scholar, is to teach the individual to act in harmony with dharma, not to pursue selfish interests at the expense of others, but to contribute to life and consider the welfare of the whole. Karma thus works to correct false beliefs and perceptions, and thereby turn us towards our true essence, Atman Brahman, so that we may live in harmony with our dharma and thereby achieve liberation. In order to make further sense of this idea of performing my dharma with an awareness of my connectedness to others, as opposed to performing my dharma because of what I might gain for myself from that act, we need to make a distinction between the jiva, the individual soul, and Atman, the true or hidden self of each individual. When we think of ourselves as individuals distinct from others, we are thinking of ourselves in terms of jiva. Jiva is the individual soul that inhabits the body like a suit. When the person dies, the body decomposes, but the soul lives on. And if one needs further karmic education, that jiva, that individual soul, is born into a new body, a different body, as part of the process of samsara. However, I am not my jiva. My jiva, my individual soul, how I perceive myself is not who or what I truly am. Who or what I truly am is Atman. Atman is the Sanskrit word for the self with a capital S. This is the hidden self, the divine core of each individual personality. It is God immanent, God within me. However, I also need to recognize that Atman, my true self, God within, is no different from Brahman, God understood as transcendent or as beyond me. Brahman, God understood as a being beyond me, is no different from Atman, God understood as the essence within me. Atman Brahman thus names this moment of recognition, when I recognize that my true self is divine, and that this divinity within me is no different from the divinity that is Brahman, the divinity that is in each other. There are many things, however, that keep me from a recognition of this truth. There is pain, there is ignorance, there is restricted consciousness. And so I need some means to overcome these things. I need yoga. And this is the last of our slides. Yoga can mean many things, but simply put, it is discipline, or way, or path. It aims at detachment from finitude and at union with God. The word shares the same root and dual connotation as our word yoke. To yoke is to unite, to yoke together two things. It is also to place under discipline training, to bring under the yoke. We might here think of a farming metaphor, or farming image of an ox under the yoke. An ox who is yoked to a plow. The ox is united with the plow. The ox is also put under something, a force that can direct it so that it can do what it needs to do. In the case of the ox, pull the plow in straight lines so that seeds can be planted. Just as the avatars provide paths to God, just as the goals that we set in our life can provide a path to moksha, to reunion with Brahman, so each kind of yoga is itself a path to Atman Brahman, to union with God, to moksha from samsara. The Gita covers the 4 fundamental traditional forms of yoga. There is karma yoga, the way of action, in which we discipline our will. We seek to perform actions focused not on the fruits of the action, but simply on the performance of actions that are good and right. There is jnana yoga, the way of knowledge. Here we discipline the intellect so that we come to grasp the right truths and think in the right way. If I think of myself as distinct from other individuals, I live in a state of ignorance and will be kept in the cycle of samsara. However, if I approach life with the right knowledge, with the truth that every being is one, is united, then I am far more likely to act in a way that will lead to moksha. Karma and jnana yoga are focused upon in books 2 and 3 of the Bhagavad Gita. Third, there is Raja Yoga, the way or path of meditation. This is covered in book 6 of the Bhagavad Gita. Here, we try to discipline our mind. This is yoga, meditative yoga, as we might commonly think about it. The meditator sits in the lotus position and tries to still his or her sensations, his or her feelings, his or her thoughts. In other words, the meditator tries to still or calm everything that he or she takes to be his or herself. The meditator tries to still or step away from jiva, the individual soul, because the idea that I am ultimately who I take myself to be as an individual, the idea is that that's false. And it's in the state of meditative yoga, in the state of pure calm, in which one is no longer distracted by thoughts, by feelings, by sensations, that one comes to encounter the hidden self, encounter Atman. And one, in encountering Atman, is encountering Brahman. And that experience of union with Brahman is nirvana. So in Raja Yoga, one gets a taste of what moksha is. One gets a taste of that joy, of that calm. The 4th kind of yoga is bhakti yoga, the way of love. According to this path, one must perform every action as if it is a loving sacrifice to God. In this way, one will focus not on the fruits of the action. One will instead focus on union with God. Bhakti yoga is an innovation. It is a major innovation in the Bhagavad Gita. In other words, karma yoga, jnana yoga, and raja yoga pre-exist the Bhagavad Gita. But bhakti yoga is something new introduced by Krishna. It's introduced by Krishna out of love for humanity as a way to help humanity play a role in preserving the dharma, the order of things. But keep in mind that all 4 paths are really just one way of looking at the same thing. They are the sum of what one must do to realize who and what God is and experience reunion with God. Simply put, one must renounce selfish thoughts and attachments and turn oneself to the true nature of reality. And so we can end now with 2 things. We can go back to our opening line of text, and we can review the concepts. First, let's go back to the opening line of text and see if we've removed some of the obstacles that keep us from understanding a line such as this. Hopefully we are now in a position to see that when Krishna says the man of pure discipline sees identity in everything, Krishna is speaking of the jnana yoga, by which the good person disciplines his or her mind so as to see the true nature of reality. There is only one reality, and so there is no true distinction between me and you. We are connected. The man of pure discipline sees this whether he is experiencing joy or whether she is experiencing suffering. This, we now know, points to karmic yoga. Karma yoga is that yoga in which I try to discipline my will, my emotions, and not respond to the pain, the pleasure, the satisfaction I get from things. Feelings, sensations such as fear, anger, pleasure, pain that can cloud our thinking. It can cloud our acting. Through analogy with the self, in other words, the man of pure discipline realizes that when he thinks about what he or she ought to do, he or she must recognize that he must think about the other person through an analogy with the self, the HUMN within him or her. So the man or woman of pure discipline realizes that the true nature of his or herself is HUMN. But if he or she realizes this, then he or she also realizes that the true nature of the other person is this same HUMN. And so when thinking about what to do, the person of pure discipline must think equally about the needs of the self and the needs of the other. It is only when one does this that one is a person of pure discipline, a person of pure yoga. The person of pure yoga sees these things, knows these things, feels these things, lives out of this recognition, and thereby performs the right actions in the right way. And such a person will do this out of love of the divine. And it's this person who will overcome the obstacles that stand in the way of moksha. At this point, if you have another few minutes, I'd suggest that you look at the following 13 terms and you quickly jot down a word or short phrase defining each term. Ideally, you should be in a point now where, without looking at anything else, you can quickly define each of these key terms. If you can do that, then you are in great shape.